For 25 years, he has worked to improve the very fabric of Nepalese society. Anil Chitrakar, a leading social entrepreneur, believes that social projects should be designed for economic, social and environmental sustainability.
And he has successfully mobilized Nepalese communities over and over again to act on initiatives ranging from preserving their history and culture, to re-engineering energy and water supplies, to reverse deforestation.
And we have the pleasure this morning to have Anil on our show to tell us more about what he does. So Anil, what's your mission and why are you on this path of social entrepreneurship?
Well, I think, many of us, we get motivated by the fact that, there are all these solutions, there are all these ideas, there's all this supply side in the world, and yet the demand side is also out there. Just as an example, this year, at the end of this year, 1.5 billion people will be using, mobile phones. Now, it's really shocking when you think half of humanity has never made a phone call. So why this gap, between, people who have mobiles and people who've never made a phone call? So the idea always has been, like in the world, the principle would be who came first, who came second. For us, I guess the principle is, did everybody come on time? And so we have to bring everybody, up there.
Up to speed. But what made you start on this track? Was there something that happened, or?
I had a good schooling. I did my engineering, then studied energy planning at the University of Pennsylvania. Went back to Nepal, trying to get these villages where women spent, 18 hours, just to feed themselves, to, bring the energy to their home. And you saw all this, drudgery and a difficult life. And yet you knew all these solutions existed. And so the idea always was, why can't we bridge this gap between all these inventions and great ideas and the people who actually need it? And so just as an example, I would watch women in Nepali villages, tie their children, to the house post before they went to fetch water. And for me, this was quite shocking because, we didn't grow up that way. And then you think, why do they have to grow up this way? So what does it take to bring water to the village? Well, very little. And so it's this kind of, the need to bridge this.
So in the process, let's take the example further, and you wanted to bring water to the village. It is not difficult, but what did you have to do to make that happen?
So, the technology, that's easy. As an engineer, there's just wires and valves and, some machines that you put together. So that's the easy part. The more difficult part is how do you organize the community? So what I looked at, this is almost 20 years ago now, is to look at the fact that very few people were experts. There were a lot of college-going students. Almost 80% of Nepal, the children were enrolled in schools, but the adults were mostly illiterate. So the system that I designed was basically where experts train college-level youth. College-level youth would train the school children. The school children would then train their parents. And when they all came together, then we did the projects. So this way, the adoption rate for any new solution was much higher than when we just worked directly with the adults.
So it's like a mentor scheme, you have someone to teach you and train you.
Because, these kids who are in school have a much better grasp of, technology, for, what the science behind it was. And so the adoption rate would be much higher. Just give you an example. When we did hydropower, for example, in Nepali villages, I would explain, how hydropower works. At the end of the meeting, the adults would ask, if you remove the energy from the water, will the rice still grow? Now, for you and me, that sounds like a very odd question, but for the illiterate person, that's a very good question.
Right.
But then the children would get it. And so the children would convince their parents. And so when you bring them all together, the adoption rates were very, very high.
And that's why you sort of made a focus on youth. I mean, in one of the other projects, Kathmandu 2020,
yes.
Now, that was very interesting, where you went out and said, what would you like to see the country like in 2020, and what can you do about it?
Exactly. And, what is really amazing is young people have a very open mind. And so when you make a vision, so 2020 would be, what kind of city do you want to live in? But then what are you willing to do in the next 2 weeks to get there? And just to give you a few examples, like I will not ride my motorcycle 2 days a week. Now that's a huge commitment. I will not go and, buy with plastic bags. I will segregate my garbage. Then you get these young people really proactive. So for example, you can use many, little schemes, neighborhood schemes, to actually improve the city as a whole. So for example, it's one of the first cities in the world that converted all its diesel transport into electric. And what it took was for young people to understand that a polluting vehicle, you pay 3 rupees. But then for clean air, you paid 6 rupees. Now, normally, you get into a strike because you've raised the cost of transport from 3 to 6 rupees.
Right.
But because you got young people to understand that clean air costs money, the willingness to pay 6 rupees was higher. So how do you bring this kind of change? It's through young people. because they understand clean air.
But how easy was it to do that, to convince them?
Well, now it's young people.
How difficult was it?
Talking about it now is easy. But we had to do many, things to get there.
Right.
But like, for example, we had to give tax holidays to people who invested in electric vehicles. The most difficult thing was to make sure that the electric vehicles got the most profitable routes. But then this willingness to pay, 6 rupees per ride instead of 3 was definitely, very challenging. But then the education that we brought up for young people was to get them to understand that either you pay for a doctor's fee, you either pay for medicine, or you pay for hospitalization, or you pay for the ride. And people got this. People got the cost benefit of clean air.
It's a very new concept that you're bringing into the country. I mean, it's a way of life so many years, and now there's a major change because of technological advancement and so on and so forth. How accepting were the people, and how helpful was the government? How open were they?
It's very difficult when you start off. So, for example, with the national parks, in 1972 we started with 11% of Nepal being protected areas. Now, the people had to go into the park to get firewood to graze their animals. And the animals would come out at night and graze in the rice fields. So there was this constant conflict between the park and the people. So we said, okay, there are solutions so that it becomes redundant for people to enter the park. So we tried to convince people to make the methane digester and then stall feed their animals, put the animal dung in the digester so that you had light, and then you had also energy for cooking. But now, because you need to stall feed the animals, there is no grazing. So it's a very simple solution. Now, to actually do it, I remember when we built the first 10 biogas plants, the first thing they said was this was a plot to make sure the village never got electricity. That we were part of the scheme, or plot, or conspiracy. Secondly, when we were actually building it, they said it will never work. And these guys are going to steal the money and run away with it.
Right.
Then when it was actually working, they said, only people close to the ruling party got it. So these things never end. But today, every house has a unit. And so now we have from 11% protected area, 19% of Nepal is protected area.
And this is all over the country. All
over Nepal.
So initially it was very, very difficult.
Right.
What about funding? How do you solve that problem?
Yes. So for example, with the electric vehicles, I'm one of those people who simply doesn't believe in subsidy. So with the electric vehicles, we got the people to pay, from 3 rupees to 6 rupees. With the national parks, we went to Parliament, changed the National Parks Act, so that 50% of the revenue of the park went to the people living in the villages adjacent to the national park. So that's how we paid for it. It actually paid for it by itself. I'm working on a solar home lighting system right now. And again, no subsidy. We give the whole solar system on credit, and each family is required to deposit the money they would normally have spent on kerosene. So now, yes, over 1 year, 2 months, 3 months, they're paid for the system because they're depositing this money in their saving and credit group every day. But the technology itself has a 5-year warranty. So, even if it takes, 1 year and, 6 months to pay for it, there's no subsidy.
From the sounds of it, it's a very practical approach. The solutions you're offering are not charity, they're not welfare. And I think people often mistake that, that community work must be free. Yeah. Whereas you're saying, you can create a system where people pay for it. And I think that makes them feel a certain sense of ownership for it as well, right?
It is a very bad analogy to use, but, foreign aid or charity is like drugs. I mean, initially you get it little at a time and it's free. And then you get addicted, then you sell your house and your property to buy it. And so, we have to get out of this aid and charity cycle. People must have self-respect, it's dignity. And so when people pay 6 or 7 rupees a day, 10 cents a day, there's dignity. But you give it to it free, it stops working after a while because they don't own it. But secondly, there's no dignity.
Right.
The fact that I got it free.
So would that be your message to people out there?
It's very, very, all over, everything that I've done is based on, this human dignity and the willingness, to pay for things.
So those are the 2 keywords that we should bear in mind when it comes to social entrepreneurship.
It is very important. Yes.
Well, thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having me.
Very interesting chat there. That was Anil Chitrakar, Ashoka Fellow from Nepal, who's here as an invited speaker at the Social Entrepreneurship Forum 2005. That's organized by the National University of Singapore Business School.
That's right, and stay with us here on Primetime Morning. We'll be right back with more.